first is when Anglicanism actually begins to be defined. And the idea begins with a term that's used fairly regularly now called via media, the middle way. Elizabeth was looking for a way to hold, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, to hold on what was good about Roman Catholicism, but to also adopt some of this stuff from the Reformation that she believed was absolutely essential. So the liturgy begins to happen in the vernacular. She's trying to hold on to both of these things, and that becomes the work of the church in England. So there is a bit of a liturgical reform. There's a movement to get people to be a bigger part of the liturgy, like you're seeing, like you saw in Germany. She wanted the liturgy to be more simple and to be very intelligible, so people understood what was going on in church. There was a big movement about turning the communion part of the church away from sacrifice and try to return it to some of its original roots. And Cranmer does play, it was some of his thoughts that helped develop the church in that direction. Of course, Bloody Mary had already beheaded Cranmer by this point, but Elizabeth is very fond of that. Okay. The final break with Rome doesn't occur until 1570, when Rome breaks with England, and there are lots of battles in England now about this Protestant Catholic thing, that the church isn't Protestant enough, that it's too Protestant, back and forth. The Puritans will come out of this process, and that will become a later thing that we'll talk about a little bit more. But England is now really working to define what it means to be Anglican in this world. So the theological Reformation in England really doesn't start until well into Elizabeth's reign. And the guy that really starts to, in heavyweight theological terms, describe what Anglicanism was all about was a man named Richard Hooker. And Richard Hooker came up with what I believe is still the easiest and best way to describe what Anglicanism was trying to do. And he used the image of a three-legged stool. Okay, and I'm sure many of you have heard that before. So what Hooker's saying is, what holds us together are three legs. One of them is Scripture. That Scripture is very, very important to us, and we're not ever going to abandon that. And that is a main thing that holds us together as a church. So in that way, Martin Luther was right. But unlike Martin Luther, he said it's not just the Bible. We are much more than just Scripture. And so he said our other leg is tradition. So what he's doing is saying we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're going to hold on to our Catholic roots and what ties us to the ancient part of the church that goes back to Jesus. That all that communion of saints, all those people that came before us, that's just as important to us as Scripture. That our tradition, that what holds us together is our tradition, and we're not letting go of that. But what Hooker added to the whole Reformational conversation was the third leg, and that is reason. That we are a thinking people, and that it's not, you can't just take the Bible and what happened in the past and assume that it works for today in our present setting. He said we have to think our way through this and figure out what these two things tell us about what what we should do with that today. He suggested that we need to interpret Scripture and tradition for our present time, and that's what separates us from the other churches, that we are also a church of reason. So you see that this was all about balance. It was about holding both the Catholic and the Protestant tradition together, and it was a way that we need to think our way through this process to get there. That has become the hallmark of Anglicanism to this very day. That is what we're all about as a church. So, when people ask if this church is Protestant or Catholic, I say yes. We are very much both Protestant and Catholic. But this is the key for us that people weren't doing. That's why in Anglicanism we've never had a problem with science and religion coming together. We believe that's an important part of the way we process things. That's why we never had any issue when the church got into critical biblical criticism in the 19th century, and we'll talk more about that. That's who we are. Okay? Sure.
Richard Hooker, what was his position? How did he get so much influence?
Well, he was an elite, but he didn't really have a position. I don't know how Elizabeth found him.
But he was speaking to her.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And she asked him to articulate this. And I urge you all to read at least a little bit of Hooker. His thought process is so beautiful and relatively easy to understand when you get past the little language barrier. But it just, when I read it, I just go, well, of course. Why didn't somebody say this before? But anyway, I think you said that really well. Okay? Good?
Good.
All right, so we get into the 1600s, and of course England falls into civil war again. The Puritans are a big part of that, and the Puritan movement began to push against everything that was going on in England, and they eventually take over in that war. They removed Charles from office. They abolished the episcopacy, and the Church of England ceases to exist again right after we got finished articulating what it was. The puritanical movement in England was not very popular because, first of all, it was despotic, and that never goes over very well in England, as we all know. And it was a very extreme movement, and of course, extremes on either side never held up for long in England. So it didn't last very long, and by 1662, the king is back in place, and the Book of Common Prayer is put back in place, and another prayer book is written then in 1662. And believe it or not, folks, that is still the official prayer book in England to this day. The 1662 prayer book. So you think we have problems translating things from 1979? Think about that. And I wonder why nobody's going to church there. Okay, I got to stop doing those little editorials.
No, you don't.
No, you don't. We removed the episcopacy.
Yeah.
It's kind of like we had that separation back in, 300 or thereabouts, where you had some bishops that went to Africa because they were getting in trouble with Rome.
Uh-huh.
When we removed the episcopacy here,
Yep.
where did those guys go to hide, and how did they come back?
Into the priest's holes.
Very good.
Yeah. Literally.
Thank you for bringing that up. So let's talk a little bit about that. Gosh, I wish Pia's husband Peter was still with us, Peter Foley. Peter Foley spent his entire career working on this at the University of Arizona. So when I used to get to this part, I just took it and gave it to Peter to tell you. So, but I will, I'll tell you. So, so those folks mostly went to Scotland.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
And they wouldn't take an oath to this despotic king in England. So most of them went to Scotland. And they became known, what is now called the non-juring bishops. And the non-jurors are the ones that wouldn't take that oath, and they kept the Apostolic Succession going and all of that in Scotland. Okay?
Same thing as what happened in, what, 300, something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Same darn thing.
Yep.
They got called the same thing.
Yep. So we're going to go to America now, but I'll just quickly leap ahead and say, so what do we do when we have to get to a bishop? Okay. So we'll get there. Okay, so let's go to America. Okay. So Anglicanism was the first denomination to arrive in America, not, as you learned probably in school, the Puritans. That was the Mayflower in 1620. And when did the Anglicans come?
1607.
1607, thank you. In
Jamestown.
Right. So that Church of England that comes, if you haven't been to Jamestown, you should go sometime if you're back there. I went last year again to remind myself, and I saw the things that I never saw before, and just how Anglican we were as a colony when we began. So that Church of England that comes is very low church. You know what I mean by low church and high church? So low church means, like today, low church would mean that you don't have a lot of accoutrements in the church.
No incense?
Yes, okay. No incense. And a really low church would be really nothing in the church but a table and even no candles, maybe even not vestments. I mean, that's really low. But things that we don't do anything else are called low church today. So high church would be what I would pejoratively call the smells and bells churches. You have lots of incense and lots of, okay, but you do everything in a formal matter. So for example, so St. Philip's now and St. Michael's are very high churches in the Anglican tradition, so high that they're called Anglo-Catholic churches. And, well, and St. Andrew's is too. I wouldn't call us low, and I don't know that we have really a low church here, but you get the idea, okay? All right, so that's the church that comes to America. Morning and evening prayer attendance is required daily in that church. There are 2 sermons on Sunday. You spend lots of time in church. You have communion every 3 months in those days in the church in America. From 1607 to 1740, there's an explosive growth of the Church of England in Virginia. The Virginia legislature passes a law that no settlers can be more than 6 miles from a church. Okay?
What?
Anglican?
6 miles?
6 miles from a church. That's the furthest you could be. By 1671, there were 48 parishes in Virginia. 48 parishes in 1671. That always blows me away.
Took a long time to get 6 miles back then.
That's great.
And by the time you get there, it's time to come back next week.
That's right, you have to camp out. That's
You gotta
why.
get there before the gospel.
That's right. After 1700, there are more and more educated clergy in America. From 1723 to 1776, most of our clergy are being educated here in America. Where?
Seabury.
Huh?
Yale.
Nope, nope, too early for Yale.
William and Mary.
College of William and Mary.
William and Mary, yes.
Of course.
Yes, yes. And so, of course, William and Mary still has Anglican roots, but that's how it all started. So education of the clergy becomes, from the very beginning in America, very, very important to this tradition. And that has become one of our hallmarks, that we have highly educated clergy. For the most part, American clergy today are more educated than British clergy, which is kind of crazy, but that's happened. That's changing a bit now because of seminary and how we're going to seminary these days, but still, education is a very, very important part of the American tradition in the church from the first days. Up to the Revolution, almost all Virginians belonged to the Church of England. 30 years later, we went from 107 parishes in Virginia to 35. Why would that be?
Consolidated.
Elimination of the 6 mile.
Yes, but there was a historical event
Elimination of the
that
6
happened in
miles.
1776.
Of the Revolution.
Revolution.
Did you have a situation where that you had the people that sided with England and the people that were against England? That was the drivers
Was
for
the
that.
dividing line?
Yep. So of course, having a church that's tied to England during the American Revolution is not
Not a growth strategy.
Exactly.
Also in Virginia, the tobacco farming declined because they were wearing up the soil. And so a lot of prosperity moved further south in the late 18th century.
That's true too. There was a population movement, yeah, and there was another issue involved in that too, free labor.
Yes.
Yes. So we'll get into the slavery issue too. Yep. Okay. So during the Revolution, 45% of Virginia clergy were pro-patriot. So it really was almost a 50-50 split on how people were responding. But nearly all of the laity in Anglican churches were pro-patriot. It was over 90%. So that'll give you some feel for what's going on in the church during this time. This is also the time of the rise of deism in the church. Anybody know about deism?
Jefferson.
So, especially in the male aristocracy, and this also contributed to the decline in the church. It's not that people left the church because the church became full of deists. They just didn't go to church all the time. So, anybody want to define deism quickly for us? Or deism's a real common sense movement. It's a very rational movement. The great metaphor for deism is seeing God as the great clockmaker who creates this clock and starts it and then steps back and takes a laissez-faire position and just lets everything run on its own. Deism is kind of the forerunner of what we now call secular humanism. But deism is very, very popular during the Revolution and before. The majority of our founding fathers were deists. They were also Anglican, of course, but they were very much influenced by deism. To give you some idea, George Washington was both Anglican and deist, of course. He went to church about one Sunday out of 5, okay? Ben Franklin, James Madison, John Jay, Patrick Henry, 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans, okay? And many of those were influenced by deism. 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans, okay? So that is our heritage. I always find it very interesting when evangelicals talk about going back to the faith of our founding fathers? because that's who they were. They were Anglicans and they were deists. So a lot of those guys are envisioning what the church would look like without a tie to the government as we're going through the revolution and all of that. So we'll get back to that. So at the time of the revolution, we had 250 buildings in Virginia, and it was down to 35 by 1810. James Madison becomes the bishop in 1800. Not that James Madison, the second cousin to the president. So just to give you some connection there with what's going on. But let's talk about the rest of the country a little bit, okay? In New England, by 1700, there are more Congregationalists than Anglicans. There are more Congregationalists up there. But there are Anglican churches from Massachusetts to South Carolina. But the church is forming very differently than it is in England. America is pluralistic, obviously, very quickly. The Church of England is in every colony by the Revolution. And the church in America is characterized by lay rule. Because it has to be. Because it's very hard to get clergy here, to get them ordained. So lay people from the very beginning take a much more important role in what will become the Episcopal Church. And that has stuck to this day. Laity have much more authority here than for example, in England. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. Okay? All right. So, those two factors in the church decline. Obviously, what happens during the Revolution, the movement of people in the South, and then there's another popular movement that's starting in the early 1800s, late 1700s, called the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening is a very interesting religious movement that occurs just in America. And it's going to happen in a different form in the 1850s, and we'll get to that. But the first Great Awakening was all about preaching a conversion of the heart. It was all about extemporaneous preaching and praying. There was no decorum in this movement. It was very charismatic. It was very enthusiastic. As my professor, Mary June Nessler, who I love to death, used to say, it was classical Protestant doctrine in enthusiastic clothes. So the Great Awakening has this really intense, there's this intense movement throughout America. It's very appealing, especially to folks who don't have a lot of education. So during that time, the Church of England becomes even more educated and elite because the other folks are leaving again. So that's part of what's happening in this decline too. Revivalism comes from the Great Awakening, again a purely American movement. And I would suggest that what will become the American fundamentalist movement, which begins in 1911, American fundamentalism begins in 1911, its roots are founded in the Great Awakening. Okay, that's kind of where it starts. Okay? So, too far ahead there, but I just need to say that. Okay, so we have this church. There's still no American bishop. And now, of course, the British aren't visiting us anymore after the Revolution. So what do? So Franklin and Washington and Madison and John Jay, those guys, they envision this church, as I said, without government ties. And they meet in Maryland in 1780. and they start to put together the beginning of this new idea of a church, and they call it the Protestant Episcopal Church. Get it? Okay? The Protestant Episcopal Church. That this is a Protestant church, but it is also Episcopal. Episcopal meaning of bishops. Okay? So we're not going to give up the three-tiered tradition in the Catholic Church of bishops, priests, and deacons, but we're going to do it in a Protestant way. So it's called the Protestant Episcopal Church. The General Convention of America is formed in Philadelphia in 1789, and as I love to say to you regularly, or semi-regular basis, approximately half the folks that serve at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia literally walk down the street to Christ Church in Philadelphia, and they form the new Protestant Episcopal Church. Okay? This church requires lay participation, and everything that this church sets up, they do with the understanding that nobody in this church can make a decision by themselves. Now, we're going to talk about polity in another class, so I'm not going to go into details about that now. But this idea that clergy can't make a decision without lay people, and lay people can't make a decision without clergy, is one of our hallmarks, and that started in 1789. And that is probably, in my mind, the biggest contribution of the Episcopal Church in America to the entire Anglican communion. And now, that's how the way things are in England, too, and in most of the Anglican Church. So I believe that our polity is our great gift to the whole communion. So, now we need a bishop. So what do? We elect Samuel Seabury to be the first bishop. Samuel Seabury doesn't get a really good rap in Hamilton. Have you all heard? Anyway, he's elected. Another hallmark of us, we elect our bishops, still do to this day, and we'll be taking part in that coming in October in our own diocese. So to be a bishop in the Church of England, you had to take an oath to the king, as we talked about. So we're back again. Apostolic Succession has remained important to the folks in America, so we go to Scotland. So Samuel Seabury gets on a boat and goes to Scotland and is ordained by those very same non-juring bishops who left in the 1600s in England. So there you go. That's how we did it. So our roots are really tied to the Scottish Church more than they are the English Church.